I am live. I am reading Many Lifetimes. It's a collaboration between Joan Marshall Grant, and Dennis Kelsey. They were married, and they wrote about the way they treated their clientele, I suppose. Joan Marshall Grant is a psychic, and she wrote 7 novels about her previous lifetimes. And Dennis Kelsey is a hypnotherapist as well, and I am here in chapter, I think it's chapter 3, the Supraphysical Body, and this chapter is by Joan Grant. They are alternate chapters. I finished the way with her treatment of a lady who eventually slept peacefully through the night, and even on the first post-operative day suffered such minor discomfort that this was easily controlled with aspirin instead of morphia. Her wound healed so rapidly that she was convalescing in my London house within a week. An example of a different technique by which energy directed at a supraphysical can affect the physical body was provided by a man of 23 who came to Trillian. I had advertised for a tutor, and among the replies was a letter from the almoner of the plastic surgery unit at East Grinstead, saying that they had a patient who had undergone several operations but was still suffering from osteomyelitis of the right shin bone, which would eventually require the amputation of his foot. However, before this could be done satisfactorily, it was considered advisable that he should have at least 3 months' holiday in which to regain his strength, and that he would benefit from a peaceful environment where he could have good food and fresh air. He would need minimal nursing care. His dressing would have to be changed by a medical practitioner every second day, but this could be done in the doctor's surgery. His medical papers were sent to our local doctor, who told me that it would be useless to try to do more for the boy than to feed him well and keep him cheerful. For in those days, before penicillin, osteomyelitis was an intractable condition. The day after the boy arrived, I took him down to the evening surgery, intending to watch the wound dressed, so that I could learn how to do it for him myself. However, the sight and stench of yards of pus-soaked packing being pulled from a 4-inch cavity in the bone made me feel so faint that I only just managed to get out of the room without either doctor or patient realizing my inadequacy. The boy was tired when we got home and decided to have dinner in bed. He gladly accepted my suggestion that I should assist him to get in and out of his bath, and recounted the history of each of his many scars, which he regarded quite objectively as a kind of battle diary. He had received them all on the first day of active combat, and had lain all night in the desert before being picked up. He had been hit by 7 different bullets. 1 had nicked a kidney, another a lung, 2 more had gone through his shoulder blade, and the other 3 had been relatively superficial, including the one which had chipped his chin bone just above the ankle. From all the major and 2 of the minor wounds he had made a surprisingly rapid recovery, and suffered very little sepsis, but the shin had become seriously infected, and had already extended his period in hospital by several months. Having taken down his dinner tray and seen him settled with a book, I joined Charles and Bill Kennedy, a close friend of Jung, in my study, where they had retreated from the rest of the house party to enjoy the last bottle of really good port. I cannot remember now what we were talking about, except that it was not concerned with the boy or his leg, when I suddenly exclaimed, "Don't talk for a minute. I have shifted level." I found myself looking at a more than life-size crucifix carved in wood and vividly colored, the wounds as though dripping with fresh blood. Kneeling in front of it, his eyes fixed on the nail driven through the feet, was a young monk, who I knew to be a previous personality of the boy who was reading in the bedroom upstairs. I knew that the young monk was praying to receive a sign of grace in the form of a stigmata, but being afraid of seeming lacking in humility, he asked that his sign should appear not on his hands or his forehead, but on his feet. My level shift lasted only for a couple of minutes, but as I returned to normal consciousness, I realized that the wound in the boy's ankle had coincided exactly with the nail driven through the outer foot of the figure on that mat, that agonizingly realistic crucifix. I was vague about the date and the other circumstances, but thought the monk was Spanish, and that he had died unshriven, probably while on a mission to South America in the 18th century. I knew, with that inner certainty, which is much more valid than logic, that the monk's supraphysical would release its energy and therefore its capacity to affect the boy's body only by given the symbol of absolution which he would recognize. He required the freedom conferred by a properly charged Eucharist. So taking a glass of port and a biscuit, I held my hands over them and prayed very intently that I might be the vehicle of the necessary blessing. I had already discovered that the boy had no interest whatever in reincarnation or any allied subject. He had been brought up in a very puritanical family, which had caused him to dislike any form of religion, and he had been obviously relieved to learn that none of us went to church. So I took him what purported to be an entirely mundane glass of port and a biscuit. 48 hours later I again took him to have his dressing changed. The doctor told me afterwards that he could hardly believe his eyes on it or his nose when he drew from the wound perfectly clean, dry packing, and saw that in the depth of it there was already healthy granulation. There was no reoccurrence of sepsis, nor did the boy suffer any further pain in his leg. However, the damage to the bone was so extensive that it remained too fragile to bear his weight evenly, and 2 years later he decided that he would walk better with an artificial foot. So he had it amputated, and from this operation he made an uneventful recovery. Another case in which an earlier supraphysical was being troublesome concerned a psychiatrist, Alec Clarkson. He first came to Treleaven because he had a tentative interest in the possibility of reincarnation through material he had collected from his patients undergoing hypnoanalysis. Subsequently, he had read 2 or 3 of my books and thought I might be an interesting subject for further research. He was on the point of leaving the house to catch a night train back to the north of England after a mutually enjoyable but uneventful weekend, when Charles gave him a brace of pheasants. As rationing was then at its most strident, pheasants were usually a most welcome gift, so we were both surprised when, instead of taking the birds, which were tied together by the neck with a loop of string, Alex looked very embarrassed and backed away, asked that the birds should be wrapped securely in a parcel. Charles, mystified, explained that the birds would travel better unwrapped, at which Alex exclaimed, "But I can't touch feathers." The words were hardly out of his mouth before I heard myself saying emphatically, "The reason you can't touch feathers is because you had a death, which was very similar to one of mine. You were left among the dead on a battlefield. I don't know where or when, but the ground was arid, pale sand and outcrops of grey rock. Vultures are watching you, 6 vultures. You are very badly wounded, but you can still move your arms. Every time you move, the vultures hop a little further away. But then they hop closer again. Now they are so close that you can smell them. They are beginning to tear at your flesh." At this point Charles interrupted me for Alex was clearly distressed. He had collapsed onto the sofa and was sweating profusely. He was obviously in no condition to travel, and thankfully accepted our suggestion that he remain at least until the following day. He went up to his room, but soon called me. Although he had tried to stop his violent shivering by having a hot bath and had put himself to bed, he was still in the grip of a spontaneous recall. He exhorted me to drive the vultures away and waved his arms as though he could still see them hopping inexorably towards him. Why did they leave me to die alone? Why? Why? Every other man had a friend to cut his throat. Why did they betray me? Me? His terror had been replaced by a rising fury of indignation. Suddenly I realized that it was this emotion which had caused him to become bound to his death by vultures. He felt that he had suffered not just a horrific death, but a betrayal by his comrades, who had left him to die alone on the battlefield. I should have realized this sooner, for I knew only too well that it was the duty of a man at arms' immediate superior to kill those who were seriously wounded, rather than to leave them to die slowly. Such a coup de grace even confirmed a form of shriving if there were no priest available to give absolution. I spent most of this night sitting on his bed, while he alternatively shivered and sweated, as though suffering from a bout of malaria. But at last I was able to make the man he had been realized that he had not been delivered. I'm just coming to the end of this. I'm just reading the last sentence. I hope none of my fellow passengers knew I was a psychiatrist, because they would have thought my behavior very odd for a member of my profession. I could not resist the temptation of taking the pheasants down from the rack and stroking them, for I was so delighted to show myself that I'm now actually enjoy touching feathers. How lovely is that? So there is going to be another part. This is Joan reading about the supraphysical body. Yes, it's going to be at least another reading. Have a wonderful Wednesday, and it is the 21st of August 2024.